The judge had already decided how the day would go. Not because of the evidence, not because of the law, because of the man standing in front of him. The defendant looked ordinary, late 60s, gray jacket, no attorney beside him, just a worn leather folder and a calm expression that somehow irritated everyone in the room. Judge Harold Whitmore leaned back in his chair and exhaled loudly enough for the microphones to catch it. The courtroom clerk glanced up. The bailiff shifted his weight, but the judge didn't care. "Mr. Lawson," Whitmore said, tapping the bench with a pen, "you've chosen to represent yourself in a federal contempt filing against the city?" A few quiet chuckles spread through the gallery. The old man nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Whitmore smirked. He'd seen this type before. Retired men with time. Men who read a few articles online and suddenly thought they understood the law. Men who believed courts were places where truth mattered more than procedure. The judge flipped through the thin stack of filings. "Your complaint," he said slowly, "alleges that the Silver Lake Housing Authority illegally seized your property without proper federal notice." He paused, then added with a hint of amusement, "And you're asking this court to order a federal review of the entire department." The gallery laughed again. A few attorneys along the wall leaned toward each other. One whispered, "This should be good." But the old man didn't react. He simply stood there, hands folded loosely. Patient. Whitmore noticed that. And something about that calm made the judge push harder. "You understand," Whitmore continued, "and that federal reviews are not triggered because someone feels wronged." The word "feels" lingered in the air. A quiet jab. Another ripple of laughter. Still no reaction from the man. He simply said, "Yes, Your Honor. That's why I didn't request it based on feelings." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Oh." Lawson opened the leather folder. Inside were several documents, carefully tabbed, carefully organized. He placed one on the evidence stand. Whitmore barely glanced at it. "What exactly do you think you've uncovered, Mr. Lawson?" The old man spoke gently. "A procedural failure." Whitmore sighed. "Everyone says that." "No, Your Honor," Lawson replied calmly. "This one is federal." That got a few more laughs, because people in that courtroom knew the hierarchy: municipal courts, state courts, federal courts, and an old man standing alone in a county courtroom didn't trigger federal oversight. It just didn't happen. Whitmore leaned forward. "You're alleging federal jurisdiction because of what, exactly?" Lawson slid another document forward. "Because the notice attached to the seizure was issued under Title 18 federal compliance language." Whitmore looked down, just briefly, then leaned back again. "That doesn't create federal jurisdiction." "I agree." The answer was immediate and strangely confident. Whitmore frowned slightly. Lawson continued, "But the signature attached to that notice does." That line shifted the air in the room, just slightly. The judge flipped through the document again, now slower. There was a name at the bottom, a name the judge had seen before, but not in housing authority filings. He glanced up. "You're suggesting the housing authority forged a federal oversight authorization?" "No," Lawson said calmly. "I'm suggesting they used one." The room went quiet. Whitmore stared at him. "That would require federal involvement." "Yes? And you think you discovered that by yourself?" Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he said something else, something strange. "Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to ask a procedural question." Whitmore sighed again. "Make it quick. Has this court been notified of the standing oversight directive issued last year?" The judge blinked. "No." Lawson nodded slowly. I thought that might be the case. Whitmore's irritation sharpened. Mr. Lawson, you don't get to imply federal directives in my courtroom without evidence. I understand. The old man reached back into the folder. He removed a single sheet, folded once, and placed it carefully on the stand. The judge picked it up. At first his expression stayed neutral. Then something changed, just slightly, because the header wasn't municipal. It wasn't state. It carried a seal. One most county courts never see. Whitmore leaned closer, reading. The courtroom began whispering again. What is that? Is that federal? The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Lawson, where did you obtain this? The old man answered calmly. It was issued to me. Whitmore's patience snapped. By who? Lawson met his eyes. The Federal Oversight Review Division. The name meant nothing to most people in the room. But it meant something to the judge, because 6 months earlier, a memo had circulated quietly through the judiciary, a warning about a new investigative body, small, unpublicized, but with unusual authority. They reviewed corruption cases, government misconduct, judicial conflicts. Most people believed the division barely existed. Rumor, nothing more. Whitmore placed the paper down slowly. You're claiming affiliation with them? Lawson shook his head. No. Then why would they issue you a directive? The old man paused. Not long. Just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then he said something that made the bailiff shift his stance. I didn't say directive. Whitmore felt a flicker of unease. Then what did you say? Lawson looked around the courtroom. At the attorneys, at the gallery, at the judge. Then he spoke quietly. I said notification. Whitmore frowned. That's not the same thing. No, Lawson said. It isn't. The judge leaned forward again. And what exactly were they notifying you about? Lawson closed the leather folder. Carefully. The room had become very still, because the old man had not raised his voice once. Not once. But somehow, the balance of the room was beginning to tilt. He answered the judge with the same calm tone he had used from the start. They were notifying me that this court, he glanced briefly toward the clerk, had been placed on the secondary review list. A murmur rippled through the gallery. The judge slammed his pen down. This is absurd. Lawson didn't react. Whitmore continued sharply. You're standing in my courtroom claiming a federal oversight body has placed this court under review? Yes? Without notifying the presiding judge? Yes? That's not how federal procedure works. The old man nodded slowly. You're right. Whitmore smirked. Finally. Then Lawson added something that drained the color from the judge's face. That's not how it works when the judge isn't part of the review. The courtroom froze. Whitmore stared at him. What are you implying? Lawson met his gaze. I'm not implying anything. The judge's voice hardened. Then say it clearly. The old man obliged. You weren't notified because the review concerns decisions issued from this bench. The silence became heavy, oppressive. Even the attorneys along the wall had stopped whispering. Whitmore forced a laugh. This is a stunt. Lawson didn't respond. Some activist nonsense designed to waste court time. Still nothing. The judge leaned back. Bailiff, we're done here. Dismiss this. But then the courtroom doors opened. Not dramatically. Just quietly. 3 people stepped inside. No uniforms, no flashing badges, just dark suits. And a woman carrying a thin metal case. The bailiff turned. What is this? One of the men showed a credential. The bailiff's posture changed instantly. The man spoke calmly. We're looking for Mr. Daniel Lawson. Every head turned. The old man didn't move. The judge frowned. "What is the meaning of this?" The suited man stepped forward. "We're here regarding Oversight File 11-72. Whitmore felt a tightness in his chest. Because that number, he had seen it once before, in that quiet memo months ago. The man continued. "We were informed Mr. Lawson might be present." Lawson nodded politely. "I am." The man gave a respectful nod. "Thank you for notifying us." Whitmore's voice cut in. "Excuse me, this is still my courtroom." The suited man turned toward the bench. "Yes, Your Honor." Then he said something that made the entire room lean forward. "We're aware." He gestured toward Lawson. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to proceed?" And for the first time since the hearing began, the old man allowed the faintest hint of a smile, because the judge still believed he understood what was happening. But that wasn't the real problem. What the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom understood yet, was that the quiet defendant standing alone at the podium had not come there to defend himself. He had come to test the court, and the test had just begun. The silence after those words didn't feel like a normal courtroom pause. It felt like pressure building in a sealed room. The judge looked from the suited agents to the old man, then back to the document sitting on the bench. Something in his mind was trying to reorganize the situation, but nothing fit. Because courts operate on hierarchy, authority, procedure, and none of those things allowed a quiet defendant to suddenly become the center of a federal inquiry. Whitmore straightened his robe. "This hearing is still under my authority." The man in the suit nodded politely. "Yes, Your Honor." But he didn't move. That bothered the judge. "Then I suggest you step outside and contact the clerk's office before interrupting court proceedings." The man glanced toward Lawson, as if waiting. Lawson gave a small nod. The suited man responded calmly. "With respect, Your Honor, we were asked to observe this hearing." Whitmore frowned. "Asked by who?" The man answered without hesitation. "The Oversight Review Division." The courtroom murmured again, because that name had now been said 3 times, and each time, the weight behind it seemed heavier. Whitmore leaned forward slowly. "I'm not familiar with any division that has authority over this court." The woman with the metal case finally spoke. Her voice was precise, measured. "Most courts aren't." That answer didn't help. The judge's irritation sharpened. "This is still a county court." "Yes. And federal divisions don't appear unannounced." "That's correct." Whitmore tapped the bench. "So explain why you're here." The man answered. "We're documenting the proceeding." "For what purpose?" There was a pause. A careful one. Then the man said, "To determine whether the procedural behavior observed in Oversight File 11-72 continues to occur." The room went still again. Whitmore's jaw tightened. "What procedural behavior?" Lawson spoke before the agent could. "Dismissal without examination." Every eye turned to him. He continued calmly. "It's part of the pattern." Whitmore slammed the bench lightly. "Mr. Lawson, you will not dictate courtroom procedure." "I'm not." "Then stop speaking as if you understand federal review standards." Lawson tilted his head slightly, and that calm expression returned again, the kind that unsettled people. "I understand them very well." The judge scoffed. "Based on what credentials?" Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the agents. The woman with the metal case stepped forward. She placed the case gently on the evidence stand. The latch clicked open. Inside were several sealed folders, each labeled with identical formatting. White tabs, black numbers. Whitmore could see them from the bench. 1164, 1168, 1170, 1172. The number made his stomach tighten again. He pointed. "What is that?" The woman replied. "Regional oversight files." "For what?" "Judicial conduct reviews." The whispering returned. Attorneys along the back wall leaned forward, because judges weren't reviewed like that. Not openly. Not like this. Whitmore forced a calm tone. "This is highly irregular." "Yes, but not unprecedented." The judge gestured toward Lawson. "And what does he have to do with it?" The man in the suit answered. "He initiated File 11-72. The words landed like a dropped weight. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Whitmore's voice cut through them. "That's impossible." The agent didn't argue. Instead, he reached into the metal case and removed a thin document. Then he handed it to the bailiff. "Please deliver this to the bench." The bailiff hesitated, then walked it up. Whitmore took it. And for the second time that day, his expression changed while reading, because the name printed under Initiating Investigator was not unfamiliar. Daniel Lawson, but the title beneath it was the real problem. Senior Field Auditor, Federal Oversight Review Division. Whitmore looked up slowly. "You expect me to believe this man is a federal auditor?" Lawson spoke quietly. "I didn't expect you to believe anything." The judge stared at him. "Then why appear as a defendant?" Lawson folded his hands again. "Because your court summoned me." Whitmore's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" Lawson nodded toward the original filing. "The contempt notice." Whitmore flipped back through the paperwork. The seizure case, the housing authority, the contempt summons. And suddenly, he realized something. Something small, but devastating. The contempt order had been signed automatically. Routine enforcement, no hearing, no investigation, just a signature. His signature. Whitmore looked up again. "You're saying the housing authority issued a seizure using federal compliance language, and when you challenged it, they filed contempt, and you let the case come here?" "Yes." The judge felt a slow wave of unease. "Why?" Lawson answered plainly. "Because this bench had already appeared in 2 regional oversight files." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Whitmore leaned back. "That's not possible." The woman with the case slid 2 additional folders onto the stand. 1164, 1168. The judge didn't touch them, but he knew what they were. Past complaints, dismissed, ignored, handled internally. Or so he had been told. Lawson continued gently. "We review patterns." Whitmore's voice dropped. "You're telling me this was a test?" "Yes." The word hung in the air. Heavy. "You allowed a contempt charge to bring you into this courtroom?" "Yes." "And the entire purpose was to observe how I handled the case?" Lawson nodded once. Whitmore laughed, but it sounded forced. "This is ridiculous." He pointed at the gallery. "You're performing a spectacle." Lawson shook his head. "No." Then he said something that made the room colder. "The spectacle was already happening." Whitmore frowned. "What does that mean?" Lawson gestured slightly toward the bench. "Dismissal without review." Then toward the file. "Contempt without examination." Then toward the room. "Authority without accountability." The judge's voice hardened. "You're accusing this court of corruption?" "No." "Then what are you accusing it of?" Lawson answered calmly. "Complacency." The word felt almost worse, because corruption implies intent. Complacency implies habit, routine, comfort. Whitmore looked at the agents. "You're actually entertaining this?" The man responded carefully. "We're documenting it." Whitmore stood from the bench. The robe shifted heavily around him. "This hearing is suspended." The agents didn't move. The woman closed the metal case slowly. Then she said something that stopped him from leaving. "Your Honor, suspending the hearing will be included in the report." Whitmore froze. He turned back slowly. "You're threatening me?" "No." "Then choose your words carefully." The woman met his gaze. "This is simply the observation phase." Whitmore looked at Lawson again. "You orchestrated this." "No." "Yes, you did." Lawson's voice remained steady. "You summoned me." The judge's mind ran through the chain again. Housing authority, federal language, contempt filing, automatic summons, his courtroom, his bench, his decisions. And suddenly something else surfaced in his memory. That quiet memo, the one most judges had dismissed, the one warning that several cities were being quietly reviewed. No headlines, no announcements, just investigations. He had laughed about it at a conference dinner, said it was political theater. Lawson seemed to read the realization on his face. "There was a letter sent to this district last year." Whitmore didn't answer. "It warned courts about compliance language misuse." The judge said nothing. Lawson continued. "The letter asked judges to examine those cases carefully." The silence became suffocating. Whitmore finally spoke. "I receive hundreds of memos." "Yes, and most of them don't matter." Lawson nodded. "That's exactly what the review is studying." The judge's voice dropped lower. "How many cities?" Lawson paused. For the first time, he seemed to consider whether to answer. Then he said quietly, "So far?" The agents remained still. The gallery leaned forward. Lawson finished the sentence. 7. The courtroom erupted into whispers again. 7 cities, 7 courts, 7 investigations. Whitmore forced a steady voice. "And what happens now?" Lawson closed the leather folder once more. "The observation phase concludes." "And then?" Lawson looked toward the agents, then back at the judge. "Then the reports go to the federal board." Whitmore's chest tightened. "What board?" Lawson answered softly. "The one that decides whether oversight becomes intervention." The word hung there. Intervention. The judge had spent 23 years on the bench. He had never seen federal intervention in a county court. Not once. He looked at Lawson again. "You could have identified yourself." "Yes. Why didn't you?" The old man gave the simplest answer yet. "Because the test wouldn't work." The judge felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. Real uncertainty. He sat down slowly. The courtroom watched him. Lawson spoke one final time before the hearing could move forward again, and his words landed like a quiet warning across the entire room. This court wasn't the only one on the list. He paused, then added, "And it wasn't the highest." The room absorbed that in silence, because suddenly, everyone realized something. If a quiet property seizure had triggered a federal investigation, if a routine contempt filing had exposed a judicial review, then something larger was moving behind the scenes. Something quiet, systematic, and still mostly invisible, but the most unsettling part was what the agents had said when they entered. They hadn't come to stop the hearing. They had come to watch it, which meant the real decision hadn't happened yet. The first time in his career, the courtroom felt unfamiliar, not hostile, not chaotic, just different. Because every decision he made from this moment forward would be recorded, reviewed, and analyzed far beyond the walls of the courthouse. The murmuring in the gallery slowly faded. Attorneys leaned back into their seats. The bailiff stood straighter than before. Even the court reporter adjusted her headphones with unusual care. The room had shifted. Authority still belonged to the bench. But now, everyone understood something else was present. Observation. Whitmore cleared his throat. The sound echoed slightly in the quiet room. "Mr. Lawson." The old man looked up calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge studied him for a long moment. "You could have presented your credentials at the start." "Yes." "You chose not to." "Yes." Whitmore tapped the bench again, slower this time. "And instead, you allowed this court to proceed under the assumption that you were simply a defendant." "That's correct." The judge leaned back. "Why?" Lawson answered without hesitation. "Because that's how the system encounters citizens." A few people in the gallery shifted. The statement wasn't aggressive, it wasn't accusatory, but it landed with uncomfortable clarity. Whitmore exhaled slowly. "You're suggesting the system behaves differently when it knows who it's dealing with." Lawson nodded. "Very often." The judge folded his hands. "You're asking this court to believe that a federal oversight division is conducting silent evaluations across multiple jurisdictions." "Yes." "And you've already mentioned 7 cities." "Yes." Whitmore looked toward the agents. Neither of them spoke. That silence confirmed something. They weren't there to argue. They were there to document. The judge looked back at Lawson. "You said earlier that this was an observation phase." "Yes." "And that phase ends today?" "Yes." Whitmore's eyes narrowed slightly. "Meaning the report will now move to the federal board you referenced." "That's correct." The judge paused. "What exactly does that board do?" Lawson considered the room before answering. "They determine whether a jurisdiction requires structural oversight." Whitmore felt the weight of those words. Structural oversight didn't mean a reprimand. It meant intervention, monitoring, federal presence inside local authority. The judge asked the next question carefully. "And what determines that decision?" Lawson spoke plainly. "Patterns." Whitmore nodded slowly. "Patterns of corruption?" "No." "Then what?" "Patterns of behavior." The courtroom absorbed that quietly, because behavior didn't require criminal intent. Only repetition. The judge looked down at the contempt filing again. A routine signature, a routine summons, a routine dismissal he had nearly issued. He looked back up. "You said this court appeared in 2 previous oversight files." "Yes." "Why wasn't I informed?" Lawson's answer came gently. "You weren't the subject of those files." Whitmore frowned. "Then what was?" Lawson gestured toward the folders on the evidence stand. "Case handling procedures." The judge understood immediately. Those earlier complaints hadn't targeted him personally. They had targeted the system of the court. Dismissals, rubber stamp filings, routine contempt orders, things that had become normal. Whitmore leaned forward again. "Let's assume for a moment everything you've said is accurate." Lawson nodded. "All right. What happens if the board determines oversight is necessary?" The old man didn't hesitate. "A federal monitor is assigned." "To the judge?" "No. To the court." Whitmore absorbed that. "Meaning every ruling becomes reviewable?" "Yes." "For how long?" Lawson answered quietly. "Until the pattern changes." The room felt colder. Whitmore had spent decades protecting the independence of his courtroom. Federal monitors were things he read about in newspapers, usually in cities where scandals exploded. Not here, not in a quiet county courtroom. The judge leaned back again. "And if the board decides oversight isn't necessary?" Lawson closed his folder. "Then the file closes." Whitmore looked at the agents, then at the gallery, then back at Lawson. "And my decision today affects that outcome." "Yes." The honesty in that answer made several people shift in their seats. Whitmore sighed. For the first time all morning, The judge seemed tired. Let's go back to the beginning. He lifted the housing authority filing, the property seizure. Lawson waited. This document used federal compliance language. Yes. Without federal authorization. Yes. And when you challenged that, they filed contempt. That's correct. Whitmore nodded slowly. And this court accepted the filing automatically. Yes? The judge glanced toward the clerk. The clerk looked down at the desk. Because that was normal procedure. Routine. Efficient. And suddenly, potentially wrong. Whitmore turned back to Lawson. Mr. Lawson, if this case had been dismissed 10 minutes ago, what would your report say? The old man answered quietly. It would say, the pattern continues. The words lingered. Whitmore exhaled slowly. Then he did something no one expected. He picked up the housing authority filing again and began reading it carefully, line by line. The courtroom stayed silent. No one moved. No one whispered. For nearly 2 full minutes, the only sound was paper turning. Then the judge reached the signature page. He stared at the federal compliance language printed across the bottom. Then he looked toward the agents. You're documenting everything. Yes. Whitmore nodded once, then he spoke clearly. Let the record reflect that the court has reviewed the seizure notice attached to this filing. The court reporter's fingers moved quickly. Whitmore continued. The language contained in this notice references federal compliance statutes that appear inconsistent with municipal authority. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances, because the judge had just said something very important. He hadn't dismissed the claim. He had acknowledged it. Whitmore continued. The court therefore finds that further review is warranted. The bailiff shifted slightly. The agents remained still. The judge raised the small wooden gavel and said something that hadn't been said in that courtroom for a long time. This matter will not be dismissed. A wave of whispers moved through the gallery. Whitmore continued calmly. The court orders a formal examination of the housing authority's seizure practices. He paused, then added the line that would echo far beyond the courtroom. And the court formally requests federal clarification regarding the compliance language used in this case. The agents exchanged a brief glance. Lawson remained completely still. Whitmore lowered the gavel. This hearing will reconvene after that review is complete. The courtroom breathed again, but something had changed, something subtle, something important. Because the judge had just done the one thing the oversight report was watching for. He had stopped the pattern. Whitmore looked down at Lawson. Mr. Lawson. Yes, Your Honor. You allowed this process to unfold without revealing who you were. Yes. The judge studied him. You trusted the court to make the right decision. Lawson answered quietly. I trusted the process to show itself. Whitmore nodded slowly. The agents began closing the metal case. The observation phase was over, but before they could leave, Whitmore spoke again. One more question. Lawson waited. The judge leaned forward slightly. You mentioned 7 cities. Yes? Whitmore held his gaze. How many files exist? For the first time that day, Lawson didn't answer immediately. The courtroom watched him. Finally, he said, The public ones. Whitmore felt the room tighten again. Yes, Lawson replied calmly. 12. A ripple of whispers spread again. 12 courts, 12 investigations, 12 patterns. Whitmore leaned back slowly. And the non-public ones? Lawson closed the leather folder. The faintest hint of that earlier smile returned. Then he gave the final answer of the day. Those numbers aren't discussed in open court. The agents lifted the metal case. The bailiff opened the doors. The observers walked out quietly. No flashing lights, no announcements, just silence. Lawson gathered his folder. He nodded politely to the judge, then walked toward the exit. Halfway to the door, Whitmore spoke one last time. "Mr. Lawson?" The old man stopped. "Yes, Your Honor?" The judge hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the agents entered. "Why this city?" Lawson turned slightly. The answer came in the same calm voice he had used all morning. "Because the complaint started here." Whitmore frowned. "What complaint?" Lawson met his eyes. "The first oversight file." The judge felt a chill. "Which one was that?" Lawson opened the door and said the final line before stepping into the hallway. "The one above yours." The door closed softly behind him. The courtroom remained silent, because everyone in that room understood something now. This wasn't a single case. It wasn't even a single court. It was a network of quiet investigations spreading city by city, and somewhere above them all, there was another file, one no one in that courtroom had seen yet, but someone, somewhere, was already writing it.